The morning of November 7, 1943. Admiral Mineichi Koga stood in the operations room of the Combined Fleet headquarters at Truk Atoll, holding an intelligence summary that his staff had delivered 30 minutes earlier. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, though not from age or infirmity. Koga was 57 years old, a career naval officer who had commanded battleships and cruisers before inheriting command of Japan's carrier forces after Admiral Yamamoto's death that April. The intelligence report detailed American shipyard activity. Specifically, it catalogued new aircraft carrier construction across 6 major American naval yards from Newport News to Bremerton. The numbers seemed impossible. His intelligence officer, Commander Nakahara, stood across the table, waiting for a response. "This says the Americans have launched 11 Essex-class carriers in the past 18 months, Koga said quietly. 11 fleet carriers, each displacing over 30,000 tons. "Yes, Admiral," Nakahara replied. "Our agents have confirmed the launches through photographic reconnaissance and dockyard worker reports. The intelligence is reliable." Koga set down the paper and walked to the wall map showing the Pacific Theater. Blue markers indicated Japanese-controlled territory, still vast despite recent losses at Guadalcanal and in the Aleutians. Red markers showed American positions, creeping westward. But it was the carrier count that dominated his thoughts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In November 1943, Japan possessed 6 operational fleet carriers. America, according to this intelligence summary, now had 14, with more completing every month. The mathematical imbalance was severe, but what troubled Koga more deeply was the production rate itself. Japan's largest shipyards could construct 1 fleet carrier every 18 to 24 months, working at maximum capacity. The Americans were apparently completing 1 every 6 weeks. The industrial disparity wasn't just significant. It was categorical, representing a difference not of degree but of fundamental capacity. "Commander," Koga said, still studying the map, "what is our current carrier construction schedule?" Nakahara consulted his notes. "Admiral Unryu is expected to complete in August 1944. Amaji in October. Katsuragi in December, assuming no delays for steel allocation or labor shortages. 3 carriers across 13 months. Meanwhile, the intelligence summary projected the Americans would complete 8 more Essex-class carriers in the same period, plus several light carriers converted from cruiser hulls. Koga returned to his desk and read the intelligence summary more carefully. The Essex-class program had been authorized in July 1940, before America even entered the war. The first keel, USS Essex, had been laid in April 1941, 8 months before Pearl Harbor. That carrier had been commissioned in December 1942, barely 19 months from keel laying to combat readiness. The speed shocked him. Japanese carriers required 24 to 30 months from keel to commissioning, sometimes longer if resources were diverted to battleship construction. The Americans had streamlined their process to under 20 months and were improving that timeline with each new hull. What explains this construction speed? Koga asked. Are they sacrificing quality? Using substandard materials? Nakahara shook his head. Our technical intelligence officers have examined photographs and specifications captured from a downed American pilot's briefing materials. The Essex-class carriers appear to be well-designed, heavily armored, with extensive damage control systems. If anything, they are over-engineered compared to our own carriers. Over-engineered, built faster, and being produced in numbers that would have seemed fantastical to pre-war naval planners. Koga's predecessor, Admiral Yamamoto, had warned about this before his death. Not in apocalyptic terms, but in the quiet, matter-of-fact way Yamamoto had discussed unpleasant strategic realities. America's industrial capacity exceeded Japan's by a factor of 10 to 1 in steel production, 20 to 1 in oil, and even greater margins in machine tools and manufacturing infrastructure. Yamamoto had gambled that Japan could win the war quickly, achieving decisive victories that would force America to accept a negotiated peace before that industrial advantage became militarily relevant. The gamble had failed at Midway in June 1942, where 4 Japanese fleet carriers had been sunk in a single day. Now, 17 months after Midway, the consequences of that failure were becoming undeniable. The American industrial machine that Yamamoto had feared was producing carriers at a rate Japan couldn't match, couldn't counter, and ultimately couldn't survive. Koga called for his senior staff officers. Within 20 minutes, 6 men assembled in the operations room. Rear Admiral Fukudome, the Chief of Staff. Captain Omei, the Operations Officer. Commander Nakahara from Intelligence. 3 other section heads responsible for logistics, aviation, and communications. Gentlemen, Koga began, I want your assessment of this intelligence regarding American carrier construction. He distributed copies of the summary. The officers read in silence. Koga watched their faces. Fukudome's expression remained neutral, professional. Omei's jaw tightened. Nakahara, who had already seen the report, looked at his hands. The numbers are accurate. Fukudome asked. Intelligence believes so, Koga replied. Multiple independent sources confirm the same general figures. The Americans have 14 fleet carriers operational or in final trials. By mid-1944, they will have over 20. Silence filled the room. Finally, Omei spoke. Admiral, even accounting for these numbers, our pilots maintain qualitative superiority. American pilots have limited combat experience. Our air groups have veterans from China, Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids. Quality can offset quantity within reasonable margins. It was the argument Koga had heard repeatedly from aviation officers. Japanese pilots were better trained, more experienced, more skilled in carrier operations. Therefore, even outnumbered, they could achieve favorable exchange ratios that would blunt American numerical advantages. The argument had merit in early 1942 when Japanese pilots possessed overwhelming experience advantages. But 17 months of continuous combat had eroded that edge. The veterans who had bombed Pearl Harbor and sunk British carriers in the Indian Ocean were increasingly dead or exhausted. Replacement pilots received abbreviated training due to fuel shortages and instructor scarcity. Meanwhile, American pilot training programs had expanded enormously. Intelligence reports indicated American pilots now received over 300 hours of flight training before entering combat, comparable to or exceeding Japanese standards. And the Americans were producing 2,000 pilots per month compared to Japan's 400. Captain Omei, Koga said, I respect our pilots' skill and courage. But please calculate the following scenario. Assume we face 15 American fleet carriers, each carrying 90 aircraft. That gives them approximately 1,350 aircraft. We currently have 6 carriers carrying approximately 70 aircraft each, for approximately 420 aircraft total. Even if our pilots achieve a 2-to-1 kill ratio, we lose. Omei began to respond, then stopped. The mathematics were undeniable. Fukudome spoke carefully. Admiral, the Americans cannot concentrate 15 carriers in a single battle. Their operational commitments are spread across the Pacific, Atlantic, and Mediterranean theaters. We will never face their entire fleet simultaneously. Perhaps not, Koga acknowledged. But we don't need to face their entire fleet to be overwhelmed. If they bring 10 carriers to a battle and we bring 4, the outcome is predetermined regardless of pilot skill. The conversation continued for another hour, circling around the same fundamental problem. Japan's carrier force was adequate for the fleet currently operational. But it was completely inadequate for the fleet America was building. And there was no realistic way to close the gap. Japan's shipyards were already operating at maximum capacity. Steel production was limited by iron ore and coal availability. Skilled labor was being diverted to army requirements, merchant shipping construction, and fortification work across the Pacific defensive perimeter. Even if resources could be found to accelerate carrier production, it would take 2 years for those carriers to reach operational status, by which time the American advantage would be even more overwhelming. After the meeting concluded, Koga remained alone in the operations room, studying the wall map. The defensive perimeter Japan had established ran from the Kurile Islands in the north, through the Marshall and Gilbert Islands in the Central Pacific, down to New Guinea and the Solomon Islands in the south. Holding this perimeter required naval superiority, which meant carrier superiority. But carrier superiority required either more carriers or significantly better pilots and aircraft. Japan was losing its pilot quality advantage through attrition. Its aircraft, particularly the Zero fighter, were being matched or exceeded by new American designs like the Hellcat. And the carrier numbers were tilting decisively toward America. Koga drafted a message to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, requesting authorization to develop contingency plans for a contracted defensive perimeter. If Japan couldn't defend the entire current perimeter against expanding American carrier forces, perhaps a smaller, more concentrated defense would be sustainable. The response came back within 48 hours. Rejected. The current defensive perimeter was deemed politically and strategically essential. Retreat was unacceptable. The Navy would defend all current positions with maximum force, which meant Koga would have to defend thousands of miles of ocean and dozens of islands with a carrier force that would soon be outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1 by an enemy whose industrial capacity showed no signs of slowing. December 1943. An updated intelligence summary arrived. The Americans had commissioned USS Bunker Hill and USS Cowpens, bringing their operational fleet carrier count to 15. USS Monterey and USS Langley, both light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, had also entered service. Simultaneously, Japan had lost the light carrier Chuyo to an American submarine torpedo. The operational carrier count was now 15 American to 5 Japanese, a 3-to-1 disadvantage that would only widen in coming months. Koga read the summary, then filed it with the previous intelligence reports. A pattern was emerging in the American construction program that went beyond simple numbers. The Essex-class carriers were being built to a standardized design with interchangeable components and modular construction techniques. This allowed rapid production but also simplified maintenance, repair, and operational logistics. Japanese carriers, by contrast, were individually designed with unique characteristics and capabilities. This provided tactical flexibility but created maintenance nightmares and complicated logistics. When a Japanese carrier needed repair, it required specific parts fabricated to unique specifications. When an American Essex-class carrier needed repair, parts could be drawn from a common pool serving the entire class. The Americans were applying industrial mass production techniques to warship construction in ways Japan had never contemplated. They were building carriers the way Ford built automobiles, with standardized designs, assembly line methods, and massive parallel production across multiple yards. And it was working. The Essex-class program represented the most successful carrier construction program in history, producing more tonnage of carriers in 2 years than Japan had built in 2 decades. January 19, 1944. Captain Toshikazu Omei sat in his quarters aboard the cruiser Atago, reviewing reconnaissance photographs that had arrived via submarine from an intelligence agent in the United States. The photographs, taken at considerable risk by a Japanese operative before his arrest by American counterintelligence, showed the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia. The images were grainy, shot from a distance with a concealed camera, but their content was unmistakable. 3 Essex-class carriers sat in various stages of construction, their massive hulls dominating the shipyard basin. Cranes towered over them. Thousands of workers swarmed across scaffolding and deck plates. The scale of activity was staggering. Omei had seen Japanese shipyards. He had visited Kyo, Yokosuka, and Sasebo, the empire's premier naval construction facilities. Those yards could build 1 fleet carrier at a time, devoting essentially their entire capacity to that single vessel. The photograph before him showed an American yard building 3 carriers simultaneously, and intelligence reports indicated this was just one of 6 yards engaged in similar work. He extracted a magnifying glass from his desk and studied the photograph more closely. The hulls appeared to be in different construction phases. One was nearly complete, with its flight deck installed and superstructure largely finished. Another was perhaps 60% complete, with the flight deck frame visible but not yet planked. The third was in early stages, just the lower hull with internal framing exposed. The staggered construction suggested a systematic production schedule. As one carrier neared completion, another was entering middle stage construction, and a third was just beginning. This allowed continuous work, preventing the feast or famine cycles that plagued Japanese shipyards where workers and resources sat idle between projects. Omei drafted a technical assessment for Admiral Koga. His analysis focused on the industrial methodology visible in the photographs. The Americans had clearly standardized their construction process, using prefabricated sections assembled in sequence. This was fundamentally different from Japanese methods, which relied on skilled craftsmen custom-fitting components. The American approach was less elegant, perhaps less refined, but it was vastly faster and allowed the use of semi-skilled labor supervised by a smaller core of experienced workers. Japan couldn't adopt this methodology even if it wanted to. The infrastructure didn't exist. The machine tools, the fabrication facilities, the trained supervisors, the systematic engineering required for modular construction, all were absent or insufficient. February 1944. Admiral Koga traveled to Tokyo to brief the Naval General Staff on fleet readiness and strategic planning. The meeting took place in the Navy Ministry Building, a Western-style structure that had survived the Kanto earthquake of 1923. Senior admirals filled the conference room. Admiral Shimoda Shigetaro, the Navy Minister and Chief of the Naval General Staff. Vice Admiral Ito Saiki, the Vice Chief. A dozen section heads and department chiefs. The atmosphere was formal, tense. Everyone knew the strategic situation was deteriorating, but no one wanted to acknowledge how severely. Koga presented his assessment methodically. Current carrier strength: 5 fleet carriers operational, 2 in repair, 3 under construction. Projected American carrier strength based on confirmed intelligence: 18 fleet carriers by June 1944, 23 by December. The ratio would be 4.6 American carriers for every Japanese carrier by year's end, assuming no losses on either side. Factoring in probable combat losses, the ratio would likely be worse. Admiral Shimoda interrupted. These American construction figures, you're confident they're accurate? Yes, Admiral, Koga replied. We have photographic confirmation, signals intelligence, and human intelligence all corroborating the same numbers. The Americans are completing approximately 2 fleet carriers per month. 2 per month. The number hung in the air. Japan's best projection was 3 carriers across all of 1944, and that assumed no disruptions from American submarine attacks on steel shipments, no American air raids on the shipyards themselves, no diversions of resources to more urgent priorities. Vice Admiral Ito spoke next. Admiral Koga, what are your recommendations for addressing this imbalance? Koga had prepared for this question. 3 options, Admiral. First, we could attempt to accelerate our own construction program. This would require diverting steel from battleship construction, reallocating skilled labor, and accepting delays in other naval projects. Even under optimal conditions, this might produce 1 additional carrier in late 1945. He paused, letting the inadequacy of that option register. Second, we could seek a decisive naval engagement now, before the American advantage becomes completely overwhelming. If we could sink 4 or 5 of their carriers in a single battle, we might restore approximate parity for 6 to 9 months. And the third option? Shimoda asked. Contract the defensive perimeter to positions we can actually defend with available forces. Abandon outlying positions, concentrate our carriers and air groups at critical points, and force the Americans to attack us under conditions of our choosing. The room fell silent. Option 3 was tantamount to admitting defeat, acknowledging that Japan couldn't hold its conquered territories against American industrial power. No one wanted to be the officer who recommended retreat. Finally, Shimoda spoke. The third option is politically impossible. The army would never accept abandoning positions they fought to capture. The government would fall. We must work within the current strategic framework. Which meant option 2. Seek a decisive battle. Gamble everything on one engagement. It was the same thinking that had led to Midway, and Midway had been a catastrophe. But what alternative existed? The meeting continued for 3 more hours, circling around the same problems without reaching meaningful solutions. When it finally concluded, Koga returned to his temporary quarters in Tokyo, exhausted and frustrated. That evening, he received an unexpected visitor. Admiral Fukuda, his chief of staff, had followed him from Truk on a separate transport. "Admiral, I apologize for the intrusion," Fukuda said. "But I felt you should see this immediately." He handed Koga a decoded radio intercept. American naval communications, partially decrypted by Japanese cryptanalysts. The message was fragmentary, but certain details were clear. References to CV-16 through CV-21, the American hull designation system for carriers. References to Pacific deployment schedule. References to March 1944 operational status. Koga read the intercept twice. If he was interpreting correctly, the Americans were planning to deploy 6 additional carriers to the Pacific by March, bringing their total force to over 20 carriers in theater. 20 carriers. Against Japan's 5 operational carriers. When was this intercepted? Koga asked. 48 hours ago, Admiral. I didn't want to send it via regular channels. Some information is too sensitive for written reports. Koga understood. If the Naval General Staff received intelligence that the Americans would have 20 carriers operational within 6 weeks, panic might set in. Better to brief select senior officers privately, allowing them to prepare psychological and strategic responses before wider dissemination. What is your assessment, Fukuda? The Chief of Staff chose his words carefully. Admiral, I believe we are facing an industrial phenomenon without historical precedent. The Americans are not simply building more carriers than we are. They are building more carriers than any nation has ever built, faster than any nation has ever built them, to a quality standard equal to or exceeding our own. This is not a temporary surge. This is their industrial base operating at what appears to be sustainable capacity. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Sustainable capacity. That was the terrifying part. Japan had mobilized its entire economy for war, stripping resources from civilian needs, conscripting labor, operating factories around the clock. The Americans were apparently doing the same while also outproducing Japan by factors of 10 or 20 to 1 in most categories. They're also building merchant ships, Fukuda continued. Our submarine force reports encountering American Liberty ships in increasing numbers. Intelligence estimates the Americans are producing merchant vessels at a rate of 3 per day. 3 ships per day. Koga absorbed this information in silence. Japan's merchant fleet was being systematically destroyed by American submarines, losing ships faster than replacement construction could offset. Meanwhile, America was building merchant ships faster than German and Japanese submarines combined could sink them. The industrial disparity wasn't limited to carriers. It extended across every category of war production. Aircraft, tanks, trucks, artillery, ammunition, fuel, everything. America was simply operating at a scale Japan couldn't comprehend, let alone match. March 19, 44. The intelligence intercept proved accurate. American carriers struck Palao, a major Japanese base in the Western Caroline Islands. The raid involved 9 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, launching over 450 aircraft in coordinated waves. Japanese air defenses, caught by surprise, were overwhelmed. Over 100 Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the ground or shot down attempting to intercept. 2 destroyers and 3 transports were sunk in the harbor. Shore installations were heavily damaged. The Americans lost 25 aircraft. Not a single American carrier was hit. Admiral Koga, whose headquarters was at Palao, had departed 2 days earlier on an inspection tour. His aircraft disappeared during the flight, lost in a storm over the Philippines. His body was never recovered. Command of the combined fleet passed to Admiral Soimu Toyoda, a 59-year-old officer who had spent much of his career in battleship and cruiser commands. Toyoda inherited a deteriorating situation he had limited ability to improve. In his first intelligence briefing as fleet commander, Toyoda reviewed updated American carrier strength estimates. The numbers had grown worse since Koga's last assessment. USS Hornet, USS Wasp, USS Franklin, USS Hancock, all commissioned in recent months. The American carrier count in the Pacific now stood at 19 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers. Japan had 4 operational fleet carriers. 1 was in repair. 2 were working up after completion. The ratio was now approximately 5 American carriers for every Japanese carrier. Toyoda asked the question every admiral had asked since Midway. How do we fight this? His operations officer, Captain Otoni, presented several scenarios. All involved concentrating Japanese carriers for a decisive battle, hoping to achieve local superiority through tactical surprise and pilot skill. None of the scenarios addressed what happened after that battle, whether victory or defeat, when the Americans brought up their reserve carriers and Japan had no reserves to commit. What are the Americans' carrier losses to date? Toyoda asked. Captain Otoni consulted his notes. Since Pearl Harbor, the Americans have lost 5 fleet carriers in combat. Lexington at Coral Sea, Yorktown at Midway, Wasp and Hornet at Guadalcanal, Princeton at Leyte, although Princeton was actually a light carrier. 5 carriers lost across 2.5 years of war. Japan had started the war with 10 carriers and was now down to 4 operational, with 6 lost in combat and 2 lost to operational accidents or submarine attacks. But the Americans had started with 7 carriers, lost 5, and now had 27. They had replaced their losses 3.5 times over while simultaneously expanding their total fleet by a factor of 4. The mathematics were devastating. Even if Japan achieved incredibly favorable kill ratios, sinking 2 American carriers for every Japanese carrier lost, the Americans would still win through sheer numerical attrition. Toyoda asked about Japanese carrier construction. The answer was discouraging. Unryu would complete in August, Amagi in September, Katsuragi in November, assuming no delays. 3 carriers across 8 months. Intelligence estimated the Americans would complete 8 fleet carriers in the same period. What about pilot production? Toyoda asked. Can we at least maintain quality advantages? The answer was worse than the carrier numbers. Japanese pilot training programs were producing approximately 350 pilots per month, down from 400 due to fuel shortages and instructor casualties. Training hours had been reduced from 300 hours to 200 hours, then to 150 hours as fuel became increasingly scarce. American pilot production had expanded to over 2,000 per month. Training hours remained at 300 hours or more. American pilots entering combat in mid-1944 were arguably better trained than Japanese pilots, certainly more numerous, and flying aircraft that were equal or superior to Japanese designs. The Hellcat fighter, in particular, had emerged as a deadly counter to the Zero. Heavily armed, well-armored, fast in a dive, the Hellcat could match the Zero in most combat scenarios and exceeded it in durability. American pilots could make mistakes and survive. Japanese pilots in lightly armored Zeros could not. April 1944. Toyoda moved his headquarters to Toritori in the Philippines, positioning closer to expected American advance routes. His staff compiled comprehensive intelligence on American carrier deployments, attempting to identify patterns that could be exploited. What they found was discouraging. The Americans were operating their carriers in task groups of 4 to 6 carriers each, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. These task groups operated independently but could concentrate rapidly if needed. They covered enormous areas of ocean, making them difficult to locate and nearly impossible to surprise. Japanese carriers, by contrast, operated in a single concentrated force. This provided mutual defense and coordinated striking power, but it also made the force easier to locate and meant that a single successful American attack could cripple Japan's entire carrier capability. The strategic implications were profound. Japan had to concentrate its carriers to have any chance of success in battle. But concentration made them vulnerable to being found and destroyed. The Americans could disperse their carriers, accepting greater risk to individual ships because they had enough carriers to absorb losses that would be catastrophic for Japan. May 1944. An intelligence officer presented Toyoda with updated construction estimates. The report included a projection chart showing American and Japanese carrier strength through the end of 1945. By December 1944, the Americans were projected to have 32 fleet carriers operational. Japan would have 7 if all construction proceeded without delays. By June 1945, the Americans would have 38 fleet carriers. Japan would have 9. By December 1945, the Americans might have 4 to 5 fleet carriers. Japan, under the most optimistic projections, would have 12. The chart made the industrial reality undeniable. Japan was building carriers as fast as its economy allowed. But America was building carriers 5 times faster, from an economic base 10 times larger, using construction methods 3 times more efficient. There was no pathway to parity. There was barely a pathway to maintaining current force ratios. And current ratios were already catastrophic. Toyoda studied the chart for several minutes. Finally, he asked, "These American projections, they assume continued production at current rates?" "Yes, Admiral," the intelligence officer replied. "Actually, there are indications the Americans may accelerate production further. They're expanding shipyard capacity and increasing steel allocation to naval construction." Accelerate further. The Americans were already producing carriers faster than Japan had thought possible. The prospect of even higher production rates seemed incomprehensible. What is the total tonnage of carriers under construction in American shipyards at this moment? Toyoda asked. The intelligence officer consulted his notes. Approximately 800,000 tons, Admiral. 12 Essex-class carriers, 3 Midway-class carriers, various light carriers and escort carriers. 800,000 tons. Japan's entire pre-war carrier fleet had displaced approximately 200,000 tons total. The Americans had 4 times that tonnage under construction simultaneously. June 19, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. Admiral Toyoda's gamble for a decisive engagement had arrived, though not under circumstances he would have chosen. The Americans were invading Saipan in the Mariana Islands, placing them within striking distance of the Japanese home islands with their new B-29 bombers. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Azawoa commanded the mobile fleet, Japan's last concentrated carrier force. 9 carriers total, 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, carrying approximately 450 aircraft. Azawoa knew the American force opposing him was larger, but intelligence estimates had been contradictory about exact numbers. The truth was worse than intelligence had suggested. The Americans had deployed 15 carriers to the Marianas, 7 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, carrying approximately 900 aircraft. The numerical disparity was severe, roughly 2 American carriers for every Japanese carrier, 2 American aircraft for every Japanese aircraft. But Azawoa believed he had advantages that could offset the numbers. Japanese aircraft had longer range than American aircraft, allowing them to strike first and retire before American counterattack. Japanese pilots, he believed, retained qualitative superiority despite recent losses. And Azawoa planned to use land-based aircraft from Guam and other Mariana bases to supplement his carrier air groups. The battle began at dawn. Japanese search planes located the American fleet. Azawoa launched his strike waves, hundreds of aircraft heading east toward the enemy carriers. Below decks on the carrier Taiho, Azawoa's flagship, crew members listened to radio transmissions from the attacking aircraft, waiting for confirmation of hits on American carriers. What they heard instead were fragmentary, desperate calls. Enemy fighters. Too many fighters. Cannot penetrate defenses. The Americans possessed a technology Japanese intelligence had underestimated: shipboard radar. American carriers detected incoming Japanese aircraft while still 70 miles away, giving them time to launch every available fighter and vector them precisely to intercept Japanese formations. American Hellcat fighters, guided by radar controllers, tore into the Japanese attack waves before they reached the carriers. The Japanese pilots, many with only a few months of training, couldn't match American pilots in dogfighting. More critically, they couldn't find the American carriers through the swarm of defending fighters. The first Japanese attack wave consisted of 6 to 9 aircraft. 4 to 2 were shot down. Only a handful reached the American carriers, and their attacks were ineffective, achieving no hits. The second wave, 128 aircraft, lost 97. The third wave, 115 aircraft, lost 73. The fourth wave, 82 aircraft, lost 49. By sunset on June 19, Azawoa had launched 428 aircraft. Only 112 returned to the carriers. Over 300 aircraft had been shot down in a single day, most without ever seeing an American carrier. American losses totaled 30 aircraft. The radio operators on Taiho listened in growing horror as the scope of the disaster became clear. One transmission, from a squadron leader who managed to survive long enough to report back, captured the essence of what Japanese pilots faced. Enemy fighter strength overwhelming. Cannot count them all. Sky full of Hellcats. Every direction, more Americans. Our attack broken up before reaching carriers. Estimate at least 400 enemy fighters airborne simultaneously. Recommend no further strikes. We cannot penetrate such defenses. 400 fighters airborne simultaneously. That single number revealed the scale of American carrier power. To have 400 fighters in the air required multiple carriers, extensive coordination, sophisticated radar direction, and industrial capacity to produce and maintain such numbers of aircraft. Admiral Azawoa, receiving these reports on Taiho's bridge, felt the crushing weight of industrial reality. His 9 carriers had launched their full strength and achieved essentially nothing. The Americans had defended with such overwhelming force that Japanese attacks simply dissolved before reaching their targets. Worse, while Azawoa's pilots were being slaughtered over the American fleet, American submarines had penetrated his screening destroyers. At 1400 hours, USS Albacore torpedoed Taiho. The carrier didn't sink immediately, but aviation fuel vapors accumulated in damaged compartments. 6 hours later, a massive explosion ripped through the ship. Taiho went down, taking over 1,600 men with her. USS Kavala torpedoed and sank the carrier Shokaku that same afternoon. Another veteran of Pearl Harbor, gone in minutes. By nightfall on June 19, Azawoa had lost 2 carriers and over 300 aircraft. He had sunk no American ships, damaged no American carriers. The mobile fleet, Japan's last hope for contesting American naval dominance, had been shattered. That night, Azawoa drafted a message to Admiral Toyoda. The text was brutally honest in ways Japanese military communications rarely were. Mobile fleet engaged enemy carrier force Mariana Islands area. Enemy carrier strength far exceeded intelligence estimates. Observed minimum 15 carriers, possibly more. Enemy fighter defenses impenetrable. Our attack waves destroyed before reaching targets. Lost carriers Taiho and Shokaku to submarine attack. Current air group strength reduced to approximately 100 aircraft from 450 at battle commencement. Enemy losses believed minimal. Friendly losses catastrophic. Recommend withdrawal to conserve remaining forces. Further offensive action with current strength would be futile. The message reached Toyoda at his headquarters in the Philippines. The fleet commander read it twice, then sat in silence for several minutes. His staff officers waited, unsure what to say. Finally, Toyoda spoke. How many carriers did Azawoa report the Americans had? 15 minimum, Admiral. Possibly more. 15. Intelligence estimates had suggested 12 to 14. The Americans had deployed even more than Japan's worst projections. And our losses? 2 fleet carriers sunk. Over 300 aircraft destroyed. Approximately 100 aircraft remaining across 7 carriers. Toyoda did the mathematics mentally. Japan had started the battle with 9 carriers. Now 7 remained operational, but with air groups so depleted they were effectively useless. Reconstituting those air groups would require months, and Japan didn't have the trained pilots to fill the squadrons. Meanwhile, the Americans had 15 carriers in the Marianas, and intelligence indicated at least 8 more carriers operating elsewhere in the Pacific. 23 American carriers against 7 depleted Japanese carriers. The ratio had reached 3 to 1, and it would only get worse. What are current projections for American carrier strength by September? Toyoda asked his intelligence officer. 27 fleet carriers, Admiral. Possibly 30 if construction accelerates as recent reports suggest. 30 American carriers by September. Japan would still have 7, assuming no further combat losses and assuming the 3 carriers currently under construction actually completed on schedule. The force ratio would be 4-1 by autumn, 5-1 by year's end. Toyoda dismissed his staff and sat alone with the battle reports. The Philippine Sea engagement would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, a term that captured the one-sided nature of the combat. Japanese aircraft had been shot down in such numbers, so easily, that American pilots compared it to hunting defenseless birds. The comparison stung, but it was accurate. Japanese pilots, inadequately trained due to fuel shortages, flying obsolescent aircraft, facing numerically superior enemy forces equipped with radar and flying superior fighters, had been slaughtered. And there was no prospect of reversing these trends. Pilot training couldn't improve while fuel remained scarce. Aircraft designs couldn't be upgraded while factories struggled to produce existing models. Carrier numbers couldn't increase while shipyards worked at maximum capacity just to complete existing hulls. America, meanwhile, faced none of these constraints. Their pilots received extensive training because they had abundant fuel. Their aircraft improved constantly because their industries could support ongoing research and development. Their carrier numbers grew monthly because their shipyards operated with seemingly unlimited resources. July 1944. Toyoda ordered the mobile fleet withdrawn to home waters. The carriers that remained, their depleted air groups could barely defend themselves, let alone conduct offensive operations. Attempting further battles would simply result in more catastrophic losses. The withdrawal marked a strategic turning point. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan's carrier fleet was effectively conceding control of the Pacific to America. The carriers would remain in port, unable to challenge American advances, unable to defend Japan's island garrisons, unable to contest American naval supremacy. A young intelligence analyst at the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, Lieutenant Matsuda, compiled a comprehensive report on American carrier construction. The report had been requested by senior officers who wanted a complete accounting of American naval shipbuilding capacity. Matsuda worked for 3 weeks, cross-referencing intelligence reports, photographic reconnaissance, signals intercepts, and technical analyses. The final document ran 40 pages with detailed appendices. But it was the summary page that captured the essential truth. American Carrier Construction Assessment, July 1944. Essex-class fleet carriers. Operational in Pacific, 19 carriers operational in Atlantic, 5 carriers in final trials, 4 carriers under construction, 8 carriers total program, 32 carriers planned. Independence-class light carriers. Operational, 9 carriers, all hulls completed. Midway-class fleet carriers. Under construction, 3 carriers expected completion, late 1945. Escort carriers, Casablanca and Commencement Bay classes. Over 60 hulls completed or under construction, production continuing. Japanese Carrier Construction Assessment, July 1944. Operational fleet carriers, 7 carriers, with depleted air groups. Under construction, 3 fleet carriers, Unryu, Amaji, Katsuragi. Projected completion, late 1944 to early 1945. The Americans are completing approximately 2 fleet carriers per month. Japan is completing approximately 1 fleet carrier every 4 months. By December 1944, the Americans will have 32 fleet carriers operational. Japan will have 10, assuming no combat losses and assuming all construction proceeds without delay. The current force ratio of approximately 3 American carriers per Japanese carrier will deteriorate to approximately 3.2 to 1 by year's end. This ratio does not account for aircraft quality, pilot training levels, or fuel availability, all areas where American advantages are significant and growing. Japanese naval aviation faces an opponent with effectively unlimited industrial capacity relative to Japan's constrained production. There is no realistic scenario under which Japan can achieve carrier parity with the United States. The best achievable outcome is maintaining current force ratios while seeking opportunities for tactically favorable engagements. Strategic naval victory is no longer attainable through carrier operations. Lieutenant Matsuda submitted his report to his superior officer, who read it with a grim expression, then forwarded it up the chain of command. The report eventually reached Admiral Toyoda, who read it carefully, then filed it without comment. What could be said? The analysis was accurate. The conclusions were sound. And the implications were devastating. August 1944. American carriers struck the Bonin Islands, coming within 700 miles of Tokyo. Japanese radar operators tracked the American formations, counting ships. 23 carriers. The operators counted again to be certain. 23 fleet and light carriers operating as a single task force, launching coordinated strikes against Japanese positions. The number exceeded Japan's entire carrier strength at the peak of its power. This was just one American task force, and intelligence indicated more carriers operating elsewhere in the Pacific. The radar operators' report reached Tokyo within hours. Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, the Navy minister, read it and called an emergency meeting of senior naval staff. 23 carriers in a single task force, Yonai said without preamble. Can anyone explain to me how we are supposed to fight this? Silence filled the conference room. Finally, Vice Admiral Azawoa, recently returned from the Philippine Sea disaster, spoke. Navy Minister, we cannot fight this through conventional means. The Americans have achieved such numerical superiority that traditional carrier warfare is impossible. They can absorb losses that would be catastrophic for us. They can operate continuously while our forces must husband resources. They can replace losses in weeks while we require months or years. Then what do you recommend? Azawoa chose his words carefully. We must accept that the carrier war is lost. Our remaining carriers should be preserved for homeland defense, used only in circumstances where we can achieve tactical surprise or where their loss would be acceptable in exchange for strategic gains. Attempting to contest American carrier dominance in open battle will simply result in our complete destruction. The admission that the carrier war was lost hung in the air. For 3 years, since Pearl Harbor, Japanese strategy had revolved around carrier dominance. The Kido Butai, the mobile fleet, the carrier strike forces had been Japan's sword and shield. Now that sword was broken and that shield was shattered. And the industrial mathematics that had made this outcome inevitable were finally undeniable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.